Welcome, welcome.
Now you're live.
All right, and the sound is good?
Yeah.
Welcome, welcome. Seward Soundwords. Sounds always good. Local writers reading their work, live on the air, 91.7 KIBH FM Seward, and on YouTube at our @Sacktown channel, SAK, all caps. Check us out there. We're live. And then this episode will play on the radio tonight at 6 p.m. If you're listening on the radio, check it out on YouTube, vice versa. We're covering it. Guest today is Doug Capra. He's back. Yeah. Doug, great to have you. Thanks. How you doing?
Good.
All right. We got a really special show today. I'm pumped. It's been a couple weeks since we've been in the booth. Always exciting to be back. For listeners, fans, a couple weeks go by, you wonder, Seward Soundwords, where's it go? Like, don't sweat it. We're going to be back. We're planning on programming and shows through the summer. We're rolling with it. So, pass it on. And thank you for listening. A lot of you, I think, are familiar with this man next to me, Doug Capra, writer, author, historian is going to be the hat we'll be getting into a lot today. Interpreter, Rockwell Kent, expert, teacher. And he brought a lot of sources today. This is going to be really fun. We're going to be going into really historical elements of Seward going back. We're going to be talking about the railroad, talking about a lot of stuff, getting into Doug's book, The Spaces Between. For the video here, I am going to be holding up a lot of neat sources, so that'll be a fun visual aspect. If you're on the radio and you want to see what these things look like, hop on YouTube at Sacktown channel. All right. Doug, I'm going to pass it to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I will. Today, I thought we'd talk a little bit about sources in Alaska history for people who are interested in writing, not just Alaska history, but any kind of history. What kind of sources do you use? Because people often ask me, where'd you get that information? How'd you find that out?
Right.
Sometimes it's just pure diligence and searching, and sometimes luck.
Yeah.
But I mean, you have to do something to get the luck. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
you can't
work.
Just sit back.
Yeah.
You got to throw the feelers out, and
yeah.
Hopefully something will come back. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about that for those of you who want to write history or historical fiction.
I think
where you can get that good information.
Yeah.
Let me start by saying that we talked about just before we went on the air. Some of you, I hope a number of you are fans of the Yellowstone series.
Right, yeah.
And the two prequels, the first one is 1883 and the second one is 1923. In terms of local history, Seward, Alaska, and by the way, for those of you who just happen to tune into this and aren't from Alaska and you're wondering what this is all about, we're from Seward, Alaska. We're along Resurrection Bay on the eastern side of the Kenai Peninsula, about 125 miles south of Anchorage. We're the terminus of the railroad, the Alaska Railroad that runs all the way to Fairbanks. That's who we are, and so we're going to talk about that. But why the Yellowstone series in 1923 and 1883? 1883 corresponds with just about the time that this area was first settled by Frank Lowell and Mary Fogels. Mary was an Alaska native, Sugpiaq, from Nanwalek on the Kenai Peninsula. Frank Lowell had come up to Alaska from Maine very early on, and he was a trader with the Alaska Commercial Company. Okay, and so 1883. Now we need to point out that the Sugpiaq people, the Alaska Native people, a maritime culture, were always in and out of Resurrection Bay. I mean, this wasn't unknown to them, of course. That's probably one of the reasons why Mary wanted to settle here.
Sure.
Okay. So 1883, the shores of Resurrection Bay are settled by the Lowells. 1923, that's when the Alaska Railroad is finished.
Yeah.
The construction starts about 1915. It's finished in 1923. And those years are very interesting historical years. In fact, I want to bring up a book that some of you are interested in Western history or the history of the United States. This is a book, a lot of people don't know about it. It's a 5-volume history of the United States written. It's covering specifically the years 1900 to 1925. Because this writer, Mark Sullivan was his name, he was a journalist. He maintains, and I agree with him, that up to that time anyway, there was never as much technological progress in this country as there was between 1900, 1925, and it happened so quickly. Now I think it's happened much more quickly in our times.
Yeah.
I mean, we just look in the early
2000 to
2000s up to now,
2025. Wow,
the
there's
iPhones and all these things.
100-year difference there
right,
for some
chips,
big
the growth.
movements.
So I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's happened like in a 10-year period.
Yeah.
In our time.
Yeah, we're in
But
it.
In 1900, you go to places like Seattle, and there were pigs and cattle walking on the street. By 1925, there were skyscrapers.
Yeah,
And
that's a
those
big
areas.
boom.
And
yeah.
you see that if you watch the series Yellowstone and you start with 1883, that's all underdeveloped
Mhm.
territory out there. And then you begin to see pictures in 1923. Then you begin to see in Helena and Bozeman, Montana, regular big buildings.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you'd gone to Chicago, you'd have seen the beginnings of skyscrapers back then. So this is the book. I'll let you hold it.
Yeah, you got it.
It's called Our Times by Mark Sullivan. It's 5 volumes. Okay. There is a 1-volume summary of it. I don't really recommend it. I recommend you go to the library and you check out the 5 volumes. You don't have to read them all because they're filled with pictures and illustrations and everything like that. And this man lived through the period. And I just want to read you one comment. When I first read it, there were so many insights into it that I had to read it a couple of times. And he writes this, the first volume, by the way, this is the first volume. And what he covers from about the 1880s through 1900, he says, because if you want to understand the people who made it happen between 1900 and 1925, you need to understand how they were raised. So you got to go back to the 1880s. And he talks about the growth of education. And one of the things he says, when people could not read, who wrote the ballads of a nation may have been more important than who made the laws. After literacy in schools became general, the authorship of school textbooks became important. Okay, we really begin to see, I mean, now we take textbooks so much for granted.
Yeah.
They're ubiquitous all over the place. But I mean, this I brought some with me because I collect them. These are what you would see in those days. This is a word book. Beginning at about 1900 or so, the readers began to come out. That is collections of literature and so forth. That's a word book, a vocabulary book, spelling book. And here's a child's Bible history. These are from the 1880s, 1870s.
We got some artifacts in the studio today. Pretty fun.
This is an English grammar. And as a former English teacher,
Yeah.
I would never teach grammar the way they. If you want to learn English grammar, study Latin, study French, study German, study a foreign language, and you'll learn grammar. Now, I'm not saying you don't study usage. Usage is important. But these are the kind of books that came out. So anyway, I wanted to recommend that book for anyone writing American history of that period, the progressive area, that you should do that. Now let's get to let's get to the development of the railroad, because this year, 1923, 100 years from 1923, 2023 is the 100th anniversary of the completion of the Alaska Railroad.
Big deal.
The Alaska Railroad, as an infant railroad, began in Seward.
Yeah.
Okay, a man by the name of Frank Belaine, who was an entrepreneur, former newspaper man. He had worked for governors, secretaries for governors. I mean, he was one of these promoters of the period. This is a very optimistic period. This, as he's traveling around, he decides, he wants to build a railroad into the interior of Alaska. Now, in 1900, when he's planning this, I think there were about a dozen or more plans to build railroads in Alaska.
Different places.
In Alaska, yeah, from different ports.
Yeah.
Okay, different places, because there began to be a need after the gold rush. Particularly, people were looking to get into the interior of Alaska, so you needed to have a port if you were going to get anything out of the interior, particularly if you're going to go after gold.
Yeah.
But as we'll see, when Belaine started making the plans for his railroad, it wasn't gold; it was coal.
Coal.
And you need to understand, coal ran this country in the 19th century and the early 20th century. Coal built up the industry of this country. Coal is what people burned at home, unless they were out in the West burning wood. Yeah. Or in other places burning wood. So it
was still going out of Seward when I moved here. I know in 2007, 8, many years, a lot of coal coming out, going to far shores. Can you throw out some of those ports that were options? You mentioned there were like a dozen, I'm sure, these close by, Whittier, Anchorage. But I'm just curious.
There was no Anchorage back then.
Right,
so
right.
Nobody was looking toward Anchorage.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the year 1900, 1901, 1902.
Yeah.
People were looking at Valdez
Yeah.
as a port to get north. People were looking at Cordova and the area around Cordova. There was some investigation into Ship Creek, which is where Anchorage is now, possibly there.
Yep.
They were looking into what is now Whittier or
Yep.
Portage Bay. Okay,
Long
that
before the
area,
tunnel.
because there had been a gold rush in Hope in 1896, and one of the
Yep.
ways Hope got supplied, Hope is on Cook Inlet.
Yep.
Okay. A lot of material for Hope would come into Portage Bay, which is now Whittier,
Yep.
and then it would usually be a 2-day journey to travel from Hope, climbing over Portage Glacier.
Wow.
To get to that port to bring the materials back. So those were a few of the places that Mullane looked into. But in 1902, Mullane is traveling around the country with this prospectus. This is the original prospectus, 1902. It's several pages. I think it's. Can you see how many pages it is in the?
I'll go through that in a sec when we get it up here. This document.
That's the prospectus he's handing out to investors, because I would say even to some extent today, throughout territorial history, Alaska was never able to finance big, huge projects. The money always had to come from outside. It wasn't until after oil was discovered and oil became big in Alaska, and that would have been in the 70s and 80s, that there was even the potential to finance big projects. So a lot of the financing for the Alaska, for his early railroads came. So let me go over this quickly so we can move on.
Yeah.
But so 1902, he's traveling around to places like Chicago. A lot of financing came out of Chicago. In fact, this came out of Chicago from a collector in Chicago, one of the major experts in railroad history in the United States, from his collection, which didn't surprise me, because since Mullane was getting a lot of money out of Chicago, I'm sure a lot of these circulated around Chicago.
Now it's part of your collection, which we have some
Well,
examples of here.
when I'm done with it, I'm going to donate all this stuff to the Resurrection Bay Historical Society.
Oh, great.
So
Awesome.
they'll all have this material. So between, he starts off with the Alaska Central Railway in August 1903, actually 1902. In 1902, the surveyors arrived to survey the area, and then the first settlers arrived in 1903. The Alaska Central Railway, it went bankrupt about 1906, reorganized as the Alaska Northern Railway, and in 1915, it was bought out by the federal government, and the beginning of the Alaska Railroad, building Alaska Railroad. And remember, the federal government is in this because they want the coal. The Navy was very active in the Pacific, particularly in the North Pacific at that time, and they needed coal. There were no coal stations on the West Coast. All the coal was either coming across the country via train or was coming over from Britain. See, so they wanted the coal. At the same time, we know that oil is beginning to move into that area. Okay, but we haven't converted yet to oil.
Right.
Yeah. So oil.
Back then, coal's the name of the game.
All right. So there we have that. I'll hand this over to you.
Yeah. You got a plastic.
So those are the kinds of sources that you can use if you're dealing with investors. Somebody who founds a town, needs money, they're going to have a prospectus. You can look for that prospectus. They're going to have a plan. And then, of course, the newspapers. This is a copy of Seward's first newspaper that came out in 1904. This is from 1904. Yeah, this is one of the first newspapers in Seward. That's a copy of it.
Copy.
The Seward Gateway.
Seward Gateway. Gateway. Big word around here these days still.
And I will mention, you need to be careful of these early newspapers because, who do you think started these newspapers?
Railroad
Who do you think
company.
the owners?
Railroad company.
Well, yeah, John Mullane.
Yeah.
He knew, Alaska is an extension of the settlement of the West. So, Mullane knew how the West was settled, and all these towns that formed along the railway when the first railroad went through in 1869, the Transcontinental Railway. All these towns that were founded, one of the first things that the promoters of these towns did is they get a newspaper in there to promote their town, to get settlement. And then so Mullane built this newspaper up. You just got to be careful. You realize it's a promotional vehicle for the town, but still it contains a lot of very accurate information.
And I'm sure they were doing some good, hometown stories,
Absolutely.
Good news going on.
Absolutely. Well, newspapers, were written a lot differently back then. They were much more personal.
Right.
And they would, there'd be a lot of cryptic comments in there about somebody, and you have to try to figure out what they're writing about.
Yeah.
Back in 1977, when Seward was getting ready for its 75th anniversary as a town.
Yep.
That's when I really started doing my serious research into the history, and I started getting into the newspapers. And I found this. Newspaper, and
Nice.
it's from 1925, and it's called the Seward Daily Gateway 1925 Prosperity Edition. If you want to hold
That
it.
looks original. This is not a copy.
No, that isn't original. It's a copy.
Oh, it is a
Oh,
copy.
it's a copy. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and what I did,
It's an original copy.
show them the back, and you can see one of the biggest businesses in town, and actually the first bank in town is advertising the whole back page, Brown and Hawkins.
Yeah.
And then there are all kinds of historical articles in there in 1925, including some articles from Belaine telling us how he got the name of Seward.
That's a
for
nice
the
cover.
town. Yeah.
How did you get the name?
Well, I mean, in those days, there were all potential names for Seward. That's a whole issue. Is how do things get named? I mean, the last thing that imperialistic colonial powers do when they come into an area is they ask the native population, what was that called? And let's name it that.
Yeah.
You know, they name it after, new names. And that's just true.
Mm-hmm.
That's true of exploration.
Mhm.
Any kind of exploration that happens, we name it. So in Alaska depended so much on the politics of this country. They needed the politicians on their side. We weren't a state. In fact, in 1904, we weren't even a territory.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we didn't have any. We were run by federal officials. So you got to name places after people,
Mm-hmm.
people that have power. Okay, Fairbanks is named after someone that most people don't know who that was. Okay, Seward, named after Seward.
Right.
Okay,
William Seward,
right.
Secretary
Here
of
in
State.
Seward, we've got a headland called Kane's Head.
Right.
That's named after E.E. Kane, who was on the board of directors of John Belaine's Alaska Railroad, Alaska Central Railway.
Yep.
We have a glacier called Godwin Glacier. That's
Yeah.
named after Godwin,
Hind Alice.
who was
Yeah.
on the board of directors.
Yeah.
Okay, so
But you mentioned a potential name, the engineers, when they came, Chicago West
Yeah.
for Seward.
there was so much money came out of Chicago, and I find this in the Chicago newspapers. So that's another thing. I mean, if your town does have a newspaper, check to see where the investments come.
Yeah.
And go to those newspapers.
Sure.
But the early engineers that were coming out of Chicago in 1902 landed in Seward, and they put up a sign that said Chicago West.
Yeah.
And I think that was partly jest.
Yeah.
But there were, so much Chicago money
Mhm.
was coming into the Alaska
Right.
Central Railway that they wanted to name it after Chicago.
Let's try it. Fascinating stuff here on 91.7 KIBH FM Seward and on YouTube on our @Sacktown channel. Doug Capra, History of Seward, the 100-year anniversary of the railroad right outside our door here is right now. We're in 2023. Is there a month where the big celebration happens? Or
My guess is, I don't know. President Warren G. Harding came to Alaska in July of 1923 to dedicate the completion of the railroad. So maybe it'll happen then. But I know there's a traveling exhibit.
Yeah.
The Alaska Railroad has a traveling exhibit, and I know we plan to get it
Oh, cool.
in Seward. But very often in the history of the railroad, I don't want to say they leave out Seward. They leave out these two railroads because they don't. They cover them. But I don't think there's enough emphasis placed upon the two railroads. I mean, Belaine built 71 miles of track.
Mhm.
Okay. And now they weren't the best conditioned track. Okay. Because he was underfinanced with his whole project.
Mhm.
But he did get 71 miles of track built in some of the roughest
Yeah.
area. He built through mountains. He built tunnels through
Yeah.
mountains and everything like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, the loop. I remember reading about that
the
big
loop.
problem to kind of swing it back around. And we just think of like that travel driving to Anchorage. It's right along there. Like we go through
Well,
these
the
roads.
trains-
It's
in those days, and it changed in 20 years or so, but in those days, 1903, the trains, the engines weren't powerful enough to climb up certain elevations. And so
sure,
there was an
yeah.
elevation, a flat area on the way with that 71 miles. And then there was a big climb.
Yeah.
Okay. So they built this loop, and it was just like a trestle that just climbed in a couple of circles.
almost
until
like switchbacks, but circling.
to
Yeah.
get up to that
Corkscrew.
that loop. Oh, it's
Amazing.
a tremendous. I don't want to say it is as well, maybe it was as difficult. I don't want to compare it to the White Pass Railroad that came out of Skagway. That was an early railroad built by Henny, one of the railroad builders who later worked out of Cordova,
Mhm.
in the Cordova area, to build a railroad there. But this was a magnificent task to get that built. And so was the Alaska Railroad, by the way, too. I mean, the Alaska Railroad, remember, it was a federal project. Okay. So it was built by federal engineers, these engineers that had built the Panama Canal. Okay. And we learned a lot of technology in the Panama Canal. In fact, a lot of the equipment that came up to Alaska to build the Panama Canal came
from the
Panama Canal.
Wow, for the railroad.
Well,
Wow.
because the Panama Canal opened right about the time that the Alaska Railroad construction started. And
Interesting.
One of the leaders of the construction was Colonel Mears. And he had been in the Panama Canal area working on railroads there. And then during World War II, he was in France working on the railroads there too. I mean, so Mears was an expert, and he made sure he built the best railroad that he could build. Those bridges north of Anchorage that he built, it's no wonder when the Alaska Railroad was first budgeted, the first budget was $35 million. Well, it came in over $70 million.
Yeah.
Okay. But I mean, Mears wasn't about to build shoddy construction.
No, these are big projects.
That's why those bridges are still there.
Yeah.
Okay. So
I want to hit on something because you said this keyword emphasis. And before the show, prepping a little bit, we were talking about this, and you're talking about how accuracy is dependent on emphasis. Like you can get it right, but then what you really push, like, we talked about it in Yellowstone or just in any type of history, I think what you really choose to put the press on and to bring the reader's eye back to, hey, remember this is what we're talking about here. This is the big picture. This is the real important emphasis message. I think that's a really good tip for nonfiction writers.
The problem is when you're writing history, the emphasis you put on certain things can have more to do with you than they have to do with history.
Yeah.
We'll call that presentism in history. That is, if you judge people in the past based on modern standards, you have to be careful. I mean, you just can't say, oh, what they did was right. And you don't say it was right or wrong and everything, but those were the standards back then. You don't justify them.
Right.
But you say that was the thinking. You try to get into the heads of people back then. So I think sometimes, I mean, when I watch those early prequels to Yellowstone, sometimes I think the emphasis, I don't want to say it's wrong because some of the things they're showing happen. Yeah. But film has to really focus. I mean, you can't be all over the place with film. So they're putting this emphasis on it. Well, they're trying to reach modern audiences. Yep. So they're putting an emphasis that modern audiences are interested in. Yep. But sometimes those emphasis say more about us than they say about the past. So we just have to be careful.
That's well put. And to me, that brings to mind editing. Like we get to a scene on a show. It's like, well, we don't need this. It's great. Sure, I'll watch. But it's like, we already have that part. Let's move on. Let's keep the emphasis here. Like I think a lot with writing, the editing process, writing the first, second draft, and then you cut way back because you were able to say those key things you needed to communicate those three things you really need to communicate in 3 sentences rather than 3 paragraphs, And so when you get to you don't need to wait. You don't want to waste the reader's time or audience's time reading extra stuff that doesn't contribute to this essence of the story.
That's
Is that okay?
Yeah. So where do you want to go?
Yeah, we got a lot of stuff. How about the Alaskan? Robert Lund, big novel. This is the first, when I first moved to Seward, I met with Doug. I remember because Wilderness, the book I was so impressed with, and you just get the idea that Doug's a writer here in town and a historian and just kind of tapped into what's going on. And you actually recommended this book to me. I think that's how I found it. The Alaskan by Robert Lund. I read it. I was in Seward and I was already thinking, oh, I got to write a novel about this town. And so you want to write a novel, you read.
The other books.
Yeah. You read novels that have something to do with the novel you want to write. And I read this and I really enjoyed it. It kind of went right along with my arrival here. So this is The Alaskan by Robert Lund.
That's the edition that you could find at the Seward Library. You still can find that online. This book is out of print, but that's the most recent, I think, paperback edition.
Copyright 1953. That's about when it came out.
That's when the original came out.
Yep.
Yeah, 53.
And I enjoyed it. So the first 100 pages all take place in Seward, and then this main character heads out to do some mining and prospecting.
Right. This was the first paperback edition of it.
We'll keep that in the plastic. These kind of classic covers back then, what have you. Was this ever made into a movie? It has that kind of feel.
No.
Okay.
In fact, it's out of print. I think it's one of the most neglected classics.
Overlooked.
In Alaska. And here's the first edition of the hardcover.
Boom. Yeah, so in our local library here in Seward at the public library, I recommend this book. It's time I go back and read it. But yeah, I was eating it up.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about the book. In fact, can you give me the paperwork there underneath?
Yes.
There? I'm going to pull something out here.
91.7 KIBH FM Seward. Doug's quick on the draw here. Seward Soundwords, folk. We got a nice historical episode here. Nonfiction going into sources and, building your writing from sources, doing the research, finding sentences for your writing, going through stuff.
So since we're doing the Alaskan, we can talk about novels.
Yeah, let's do it. Love it.
And this novel, although it was published in 1953, it's an autobiographical novel. Robert Lund's brother was in Alaska for 40 years, and a lot of siblings follow their siblings up to Alaska. I think he came from Mormon country in Utah, and I think he came from an old Mormon family related to some of the oldest elders. Robert Lund did.
Yeah,
his brother. And he mentions at the beginning of the book, he says some of these, what I'm doing is I'm combining my adventures with my brother's adventures under one book.
Oh, they're in a little preface,
I did contact his brother many years ago and talked to his brother a little bit. His brother said, yeah. He said he's writing about me a lot, and it's some of it's his and some of it's his brother.
Yeah.
So, although it's published in 1953. It's based on his experience of arriving in Seward as a stowaway. He's 19 or 20 years old. The real Robert Lund. Mm-hmm. He was a stowaway aboard a steamship in 1934. Comes into Seward, and then his adventures in Seward. About the first third of the book takes place in Seward, 1934, 1935, and I think it's one of the most accurate pictures of coastal Alaska towns in those days. And I say this, I wasn't there, but I've been around long enough to talk to some of the old timers that were there.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, some of them disagree sometimes with some of his perspectives.
Yeah.
On things, but he's writing the perspective of a transient.
Yeah.
He's writing the perspective of a blue collar worker, of a longshoreman.
Yeah.
Of someone who's living outside of the inside. Character of Seward. But most of the old timers that I said, yeah, this is a good book. It's about Wade Carlson, this 20-year-old kid.
Right.
He begins his novel with Wade, who is on the deck of a U.S. Army transport vessel as it enters Resurrection Bay in the early spring of 1934. Carlson had sneaked aboard the ship in Seattle, along with, quote, a motley lot of poverty-stricken relievers taken from the government soup lines and sent north to open the valley at Matanuska and break the ground for the farmers who were later arrived. That's a famous story in Alaska history. The settlement of the Matanuska Valley by farmers from Wisconsin and Minnesota. They were offered free land up here.
Oh, cool.
That's a whole interesting story. Carlson stands alone on deck wearing a blue stocking cap, 2 pair of pants under his coveralls, 2 sweaters, heavy socks, and government issue shoes. Everything else he owns is in his pockets. 2 nickels, a dime, a pocket knife, and an extra pair of socks. Some Bull Durham, a bandana handkerchief, a ragged and empty wallet, and a letter from the chief of police of Cheyenne, Wyoming, attesting to his good character. From there, I really recommend this book. It's out of print, but you should be able to get a copy of it in your library, or you can buy a used paperback copy.
They're around. You see them. That's Robert Lund on wax.
Now, Robert, I did some research into Robert Lund. I won't go into a lot of detail, but I want to let you know how to do the research. I was able to contact a distant family. I knew where he was born. I know where he was born in Utah. So I found, and the name Lund is a very common name back there, but I found a David Lund, who was distantly related to him, and he found some information for me. Then I found out where he died, and it was in New York. And so I contacted that small city in central upstate New York, and I found the historian there, and she did some research for me. And I don't have time to go into it right now, but I have a packet of information she sent me. She found his death certificate. But oftentimes, officials will not let you copy a death certificate, depending on how new it is. They'll let you read it and take notes.
Yeah.
She read and she took notes, and she learned that he committed suicide.
Oh, wow.
In 1967.
Okay.
But she was able to get, because he didn't have a will, she was able to get his probate records for me and sent me all the probate records. And with that, he did have a son. I haven't been able to find the son.
67, book came out in 53. Was it like a success? Did he get a bit of a name from this book? Was it being read back then, or did it kind of? Do you know that?
It was
Probably not if he had a bad
interesting.
ending like that.
He wrote several other books. In Seward, he worked in different areas in Seward. He worked in bars, and he worked in mining and everything like that. One thing he did is he went out on one of the vessels in Seward called the Star, and in the book he calls it the Astra. Just like the saloon that he frequents here was called the Northern Saloon, but he calls it the Aurora.
Mm-hmm.
He changes names around. And by the way, as I was telling you, I had a couple of the old timers read through the book. I gave them an old paperback copy, and they took notes in it for me.
Yeah.
Telling me, well, this is so and so, and this is who so and so is. I mean, because it's a real autobiographical book.
Really cool.
But how did the he was a well-known pulp writer. I think he was better than pulp.
Yeah.
He wrote a book, Dashi-san, about Japan, because he later joined the Merchant Marines.
Oh, wow.
And he traveled around the world. He wrote a book about Japan. He wrote a book about Guam. He wrote a book, a coming-of-age story about a young 14-year-old who just leaves his home in Utah and hits the road. And that was probably him based on his life.
How long did he live in Seward, do you think?
I think he lived in Seward maybe a year or
Okay.
so. But one thing about the Alaskan that I want to emphasize here, and I think this is worth emphasizing. 1953, with the civil rights movement going on, and with the problem that Alaska Natives were having too with civil rights up here, in many respects, he's very honest in this book about what the treatment of Alaska Natives. He gets into that whole issue because the main character, Wade Carlson, falls in love with an Alaska Native woman who's originally from Cordova, and it shows how he can't go into restaurants with her, can't go into bars with her, and it's not just Seward. I mean, they're all coastal towns, and you see if you watch the Yellowstone series, you begin to see clearly in 1923, the treatment of the Native Americans.
Mistreatment
of the mistreatment of Native Americans. So I mean, I think it's a very honest book.
Yeah.
For 1953.
Yeah.
Let me just read you the beginnings of a few reviews.
For sure. Yeah.
And these are Alaskan reviews. Were it not for the implications of the title in the foreword, one would be inclined to forgive Robert Lund the fundamental shallowness of this novel. But the title seems to say that Lund will present in fictional form a prototype of Alaskans. And in the foreword, he writes that his brother Earl will, in all probability, be one of the worst critics of this book. He is a real Alaskan. And if his brother is not, it will only be because blood is thicker than objective criticism. Alaskans didn't like the book.
Didn't like the forward anyway. I mean, it doesn't seem like that one got too far into it.
In 1953, when the book came out, Alaska was vying for statehood.
Right.
And the last thing they wanted was an image of themselves that Lund is portraying of still a rough and rugged frontier in the 1930s. Okay. And Seward was, and by the way, in my book, if you want to read, there's a chapter called The Wide Open Town. I think it's the first chapter. Yeah. Seward, Alaska, 1904, a wide open town. You begin to see how rough and rugged these towns were before the area outlawed gambling and other things. The federal government got out of control to some extent earlier.
Yeah.
Here's another review. In Robert Lund's second book, he has written us a lusty, bawdy, brawling story of a group of men and women who eke out a precarious and monotonous existence in the small coastal towns of Alaska. There's another one.
That could go either way. I don't know. That kind of.
I'm not sure where that
making
went.
people want to read it.
Well, yeah. Here's another one. Alaskans have often been told they drink too much, but after reading Robert Lund's forthcoming novel, The Alaskan, there's a good excuse. It takes something strong to kill the bitter taste inspired by this allegedly authentic story.
Come on now, critics.
I'll read you one more.
Yeah.
When Robert Lund finished The Alaskan, he wrote a foreword describing it as a novel of Alaska and a work of fiction. He also predicted that Alaskans wouldn't like it. The prediction, if Alaskans are at all sensitive, will be viewed by them as an understatement, for the country couldn't have been like he says it was, even in the 1930s, and not to be rated by the behavior of the worst of its inhabitants.
He's getting a reaction, so that could be good. But Doug and I both read this book, and there's a lot of value to it. It's a good read, certainly for Sewardites.
Okay.
I like what you said about, I'm going to make a little connection here on the show, Seward Soundwords, 91.7 KIBH M. Seward. If you go back to our at Sacktown YouTube channel, you'll see an episode of Matt Genovese, brothers following brothers up to Alaska. Matt's brother Jay, who his episode is all about honoring Jay and the Brotherly Love Park. Jay, told Matt, hey, come up here. Matt followed Jay up to Seward, Alaska way back 70s now, and has made a home here and loves it. So that is a common thing. And now our shows are archived on YouTube, so you pass on the word or go back. They're there for listeners and fans to go through whenever you'd like. They'll be there, so that's a good thing, including this episode.
Where do you want to go? You've got all the stuff over
Yeah,
there.
so I know you want to talk about the, let's see. Yep. You want to go to the case? Is that the, I'll pass you that, but I know there's a lot on that, so let you get organized on.
Oh, all this.
Yeah.
Well, just here's an interesting booklet you can show. This is the federal government publishes a lot of interesting documents that you need to get in touch with. In fact, I'll tell you this right now. As an ex-National Park Ranger,
yeah,
the National Park Service does a lot of historical publications, and they're not widely circulated. So, I mean, if you're in an area with a national park, find out what history they have written and published, and sometimes it's free.
Yeah,
I have a whole shelf, and I've been not because I took them when I was a National Park Ranger, because they were free. They just published them.
Yeah,
on the histories of certain areas.
Good info.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
This is a book called General Information Regarding the Territory of Alaska, and it's published in 1931. So if you're doing something like I was, writing about Robert Lund in the 30s in the book The Alaskan, that's a good kind of a source book. But look for all these federal documents and USGS, geological surveys that occurred.
Yeah.
Contain a lot of historical information also.
Did you want to talk about this book at all? I got
Yeah,
this in my pile.
I'll talk about that.
Hop there.
Take this
Okay.
one back. This is a very important book. I'll let you hold it up.
You got it.
This is the Federal Writers Project book on Alaska. During the Depression, the Works Progress Administration of the federal government hired writers and artists and poets, painters, people who collected folklore, people who collected music, to travel around the country to give them work. Mm-hmm. And also to do some historical work. Well, the Federal Writers Project was a project to write the travel guides for each of the states. And the Alaska Travel Guide was written by Merle Colby.
Merle Colby, for all the radio listeners who didn't see it. Merle Colby, A Guide to Alaska.
Now, if you try to get one, whether you have a dust jacket or not, I don't know. You can get one from the library probably, or get one on loan. But try to get one that on the back of it has a map. I'm not gonna take the map out right now.
Oh, it's just tucked right in there. Nice.
Right
Yeah, that's cool.
There's a map.
We like maps.
Now I wonder if I have Seward here. The chapter on Seward tells a little bit about the history of Seward, about the Alaska Railroad, and tells about what businesses are around. It's an example of an early guidebook, but it's more based on history than most of these guidebooks are, that just give you a milepost and places to stop and get gas and everything. It really goes into the history of these areas. So,
well, I like to think that a lot of tourists and visitors that come to Seward, history that's part of this trip for them, right? Like trying to see what life was like here and how this town come to be. We have all those, the new like placard signs all around that historical tour of downtown Seward. I imagine like tourists really enjoy self-guided tour. Of course, it's this beautiful walk right along the water, seeing the old stucco homes and stuff. So history is alive and a big part of our town and the future of our town.
Right, it is. I mean, Seward
and the draw to our town.
Seward has one of, not the only one. I mean, Skagway has an old downtown too.
Right. Yeah.
But Seward is one of the few towns that really have an intact old downtown anymore. There was a fire in 1941 that destroyed the eastern part of the street, and then there was another one in 41 that destroyed some more. But we have a lot of old buildings that go back. Right.
Maybe you feel the history here so much. Certainly that landscape, right? But Brown and Hawkins, right? A building
Brown and Hawkins, and a few streets to the east, we have the old telegraph office that was built in 1905. That building is still there, one of the older buildings in town. Van Gilder Hotel,
Sure.
and then what we call Millionaires Row,
Yeah.
which is very interesting. When Belaine first forms this town, a lot of his officials, railroad officials, of course, come up from Seattle.
Yeah.
And they're relatively wealthy people,
Yep.
and they build a series of houses along 3rd Avenue, which
Yep.
is now the Seward Highway, that are the kinds of upper middle class houses you would have found in Seattle at that time. And it became known as Millionaires Row.
Right.
But the point I make when I write about it is what Belaine is doing. He's trying to point this out. He's trying to point out that Seward is not this little gold rush town. You know, most gold rush towns, there's a gold strike.
Yeah.
Somebody builds a cabin.
Yeah.
More prospectors come, build cabins.
Fast.
Haphazardly built.
Yeah. Quick.
And then
shelter.
when they decide to organize everything, and then they lay out the streets.
Yeah.
And they got to move the cabins.
Right. Right.
Seward is not one of those towns. In 1902, Belaine sent up a survey team.
Planned
He
it out.
surveyed the whole town, got all the streets laid out, all the lots laid out.
Yeah.
In 1903, they had an auction. As soon as people landed, they set up a commissary, fed them some lunch, and then they had an auction and auctioned off the lots.
Yeah.
And the point I want to bring up too, when I was talking about Our Times, that book by Mark Sullivan, the technology that is occurring between 1900 and 1903. Okay, when Belaine had Seward built, he built it with all the modern technology. Telephones went in right away. Okay, you see, the intention was to build Seward as a permanent town. Of course, these promoters, these entrepreneurs back then were so optimistic. I mean, he saw Seward as being maybe the capital.
They're going big picture, years ahead.
Years ahead.
Many
of course,
decades.
remember, in 1903, there was no Anchorage.
Right.
Anchorage doesn't even come into existence until it's a tent city, about 1914.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, we laugh at him, and there's nothing really big on the Kenai Peninsula. Homer is a small village. Kenai is still an old Russian fort. There's no Soldotna on the Kenai Peninsula.
Right. Oh, at the time.
Seward is the major, in 1914, before Anchorage really builds up, Seward is the major community to the westward.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were going out into the Aleutian Islands, into the Bristol Bay area, you'd take a vessel out of Seward.
Yeah.
And if you were heading north, you'd take the train, or you'd take a dog team out of Seward. So
there you
Seward
go.
is a major place.
I mean, it was kind of the front runner for capital right along with the railroad, right?
Yeah. So Belaine, when he's building Seward, he builds in all these modern.
This is going to be the capital city. We got to be organized. We got to.
Electricity went in.
Right
where the foundation, electricity went in, telephones went
That's
in.
modern stuff, I imagine.
And you'd find people out in rural America in the Midwest that didn't have that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And you do right here. When people visited Seward in 1906, 1907, newspapermen, other people were shocked at what was available in Seward.
In the organization, or just like that there was
the technology.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
The infrastructure.
Right.
Now, Southeast Alaska, Ketchikan, Juneau, they'd been around. I mean, Juneau was founded in 1880.
Okay.
Ketchikan was an old fishing town. So you wouldn't be totally surprised if you saw some of this there.
Because it has some history.
And you come up to Seward in 1906.
Brand new town.
Brand new town.
Yeah.
It looks like it's been there for 20 years.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I mean, that grid of town I was spending, walking downtown, you feel that history, like the grid, how they laid it out, the alleys, like that is that feels like what it was like back then. I know it's expanded, but it just has this it's very pleasant to me. I lived downtown for a long time. I loved it. Of course, you're by the ocean, but feeling the history and the different houses and all the character to them, that gave me a great feeling. I like that. It had a historical feeling tied to the past. This is what it looked like then.
It was built for permanence.
Yeah.
And if you want, you just can't say this town's built for permanence.
No.
You've got to show it.
Yeah.
So as you're attracting investors.
Yeah.
Investors came from as far away as Europe to invest, and they were surprised.
Yeah.
At what the town had in those early years.
All right, you might want to move to that. It's time.
We'll move here.
A little bit of a time. We got about 15
book.
minutes to go. This is Doug Capra on Seward Soundwords here on 91.7 KIBH FM Seward. Thanks,
one of the interesting stories in my book here.
The Spaces Between by Doug Capra. A lot of big nonfiction stories in here. Nice book. Ember Press. Go ahead, Doug.
And,
You need the
and
book?
just but by the way, one of the you mentioned Rockwell Kent a few times.
Oh, yeah.
American artist who came to Alaska.
Yep.
In 1918, 1919. I've written a lot about him. There are 2 chapters on Rockwell Kent in
Yep.
this book.
I do want to get in real quick also that Doug just did a conference on Rockwell Kent connected with the gallery in upstate New York, and he presented on a presentation called The Turbulent Origins of Rockwell Kent's Wilderness. This was just a couple weeks ago, so nice work there. Great job. Getting out.
And Rockwell Kent's, that's another book that's a classic in Alaska history. It's called
Wilderness.
Yeah. A Journal of Quiet Adventure in Alaska by Rockwell Kent. And it tells about his stay on Fox Island and Resurrection Bay here just out of Seward between 1918 and 1919 with his 9-year-old son. And it's filled with all his brush and inks. People look at those and think they're woodcuts.
Oh, they do look like that.
Later he became an expert in woodcuts.
Yeah.
He was just learning woodcuts when he was here.
Oh, cool.
But they're, the fine brush and ink he's doing out there on Fox Island are beautiful pictures in the book. And then you can look at his paintings from Resurrection Bay too. They're beautiful. One of the interesting stories in this book, in my book, is called let me find it here. It's called A Satanic Brain in Degenerate Mind. And it's about one of the early murders in Alaska history, actually up to the time until we started getting the serial killers like Butcher Baker. If you've never heard of Butcher Baker, look him up. There was a movie made about Butcher Baker. Wasn't there? I can't. Yeah. But until we started getting those serial killers, this man who's maybe his name was Dempsey, William Dempsey. I'm not even sure we know who he really was, but he killed a prostitute up in Anchorage. And then to escape, then he came down to Seward, and he worked for a while out on the railroad. This is in 1919, so the railroad's being built. And then when he comes into town to get his paycheck, they're looking for him. And so the U.S. Deputy Marshal stops him and is taking him to jail, and he shoots and he murders the U.S. Deputy Marshal. It was one of the most interesting cases. And anyway, he's brought to Valdez. You want to show a picture of him?
Sure, yeah.
This is a picture from 1919, and then on the back is a picture later.
William Dempsey.
Okay, later, before you show this picture, let me just say that he was eventually tried in Valdez, sentenced to hang. The president of the United States commuted it to life in prison, and that's a whole story. I cover that in the story in the book.
Okay.
He ends up in McNeil Island Prison off the coast of Washington, then in Leavenworth for a while. Then he goes back to McNeil Island, and about 1940, he escapes McNeil Island and is never found. Nobody knows what happened to him. He becomes top 10 FBI. This is his FBI most wanted list. And that this murder, the first murder of the prostitute, happens up in Anchorage. Dumps her body down into a well. They chase him down to Seward. They capture him in Seward. In fact,
I was tie in here. Do you want those nearby? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. The building where the jail was is still standing. And for many years ago, I was on the Historic Preservation Commission here, and one of the other members was Virginia Darling, who was a little girl back then. And I remember mentioning this during one of our meetings. I said, "Yeah, and Dempsey shot the U.S. Deputy Marshal right here across from where we're sitting here." And Virginia says, "I know, I heard the shot."
Oof.
I mean, it shows you how young Seward is, how young Alaska is. I mean, this must have been in the 1980s, I think, the early 80s.
Wow.
And she gave me some information which she could remember about it. But anyway, so I just want to read one thing to you. He writes this letter, and I found a copy of the letter. He's 19 years old. He's in the Valdez jail, and he writes this letter, and you can show him. Show them a copy of this letter.
And you got it in the book. Okay.
As I read it in the book. 19 years old, and he writes this letter.
Some more sources. Doug has tracked down.
And I find
this. I
found this in the National Archives branch when we did have one in Alaska. Since we don't have one in Alaska anymore. But here's what he writes. He's writing it to Pop. He says, "Dear Pop, I'm in a jail in Valdez, Alaska, on the charge of murder. And he goes on to plead with the man whose real name is Wendell. He goes to plead to this man he's writing to, Pop, to send money for a top lawyer, and he promises to change his ways and become a good citizen. He says, "I wish I'd never left New York, for I am in grave danger now here in Valdez. Upon my release, I do swear before the Almighty God to repay you whatever expenses you will have gone to." And then he reflects on his life. He says, "One that has knocked around like I have is bound to come to some bad ending sometime." Okay. Ironically, what he doesn't know is that the man he's writing to in 1919 was the Wendell who had died tragically in France in 1917 during World War I as a naval aviator. Okay. And Wendell at the time was the superintendent of the Children's Aid Society in New York City. And supposedly Dempsey comes from a family in the Midwest, and he becomes violent in that family. But if you look on his most wanted list, he's got all these aliases. I'm not even sure who he really was. My guess, and I can't document this, but I'm telling you this story right now just to show you how these stories never end.
Yeah.
The research can go on and on and on and on. So this isn't covered in the story here, but I think I might have mentioned this in the story, though. I think that he may have been a street kid in New York that was put on one of these orphan trains that was sent to the Midwest. Now, before he was sent, he was in one of these orphanages where Wendell, he calls him Pop, was in charge.
Right.
Then he gets put on an orphan train and is sent out west with his family in the Midwest, and they can't handle him anymore. And, you know, he probably leaves home. He's 19 years old in Alaska. He probably leaves when he's quite young. So, but that's just an example of what kind of information you can get. The FBI, most wanted list, go to National Archive sources.
Yeah. And letters and journals we talked about is a big thing you pull from. So I'd like you to talk a little more about that and like the difference between them. Because is that like your main source, like where you've got the best stuff in your career as an author and historical writer? Letters.
In Rockwell Kent, Rockwell Kent was a prolific letter writer, and the letters that were going back and forth when he was on Fox Island during 1918, 1919 are extremely revealing. Okay. And letters can be, I think, even more revealing than journals can. Sometimes you start writing a journal and pretty soon you think you're writing a book. Right. You know, and so you start manipulating the narrative a little bit, but more often than not, letters are to one person, and usually a person that you know well and you can trust. So I would really recommend letters.
You're going to be more honest and communicate these things you need to communicate, you know. So, you know, with Dempsey, here's a criminal. So I don't know about honesty there, but he's saying, you know, I knocked around and I need money. I mean, that was certainly true, you know, but this guy.
That's why letters get burnt. In fact, one of my favorite women authors from the 19th century is Jane Austen.
Sure.
Unfortunately, we don't know much about Jane Austen because her sisters burned all of her letters.
Right.
You know, and that has happened too often. It's too bad. I mean, certainly, I guess you can make a point. People have a right to do that.
Be forgotten.
Do that. But you know, we lose a lot too. And let me mention this, and this can be the end of it. There's a chapter in my book, which is called, let me find the title here. Seward's Good Time Girls. You know, good time girls were guys would pull into a port like Seward, and there were euphemisms they would use. They'd go to the cab driver, or they'd go to the bar and they'd say, "We're going to have a good time around here." Good time. Where's the red light district? Where are the body houses here? So they were called the Good Time Girls, and it's about Seward's red light district. And one of my sources was actually written by a woman in later years who had some body houses here in Seward. And this is the book. It's called The Orderly Disorderly House. I mention it in here.
The Orderly Disorderly House by Carol Irwin.
And Carol Irwin later, after she got out of that, I think she got out of it, she was a painter. She painted these beautiful landscapes of Seward. And the Women's Club gave her some shows around here. You know, they did. I mean, there's a lot of stories in Seward, some of them that I know that I'm not allowed to tell.
Okay.
And people have said, "I'll tell you, but you can't tell anybody."
Certainly not here.
Families that have originated in this town from the women who came in as madams and all this money. And, you know,
big money, big career opportunity.
Here's the paperback. And you know,
So are there Carol Irwin paintings, canvases around town?
I
Do
think there may
fish-
be
you
some
know
in
of
the,
any?
in the museum. There may be some in the
All right.
museum, and I
That'd
think
be-
there are some around town too. And there's another book by a madam who came up to Seward. She was more in Ketchikan. And if you want that information, it's in the bibliography or in the sources of this book under the chapter, The Good Time Girls. And that's another fascinating one. She wrote another detailed book, and I use these sources to tell from their perspective what life was really like in these body houses. As I was telling you, the old timers used to tell me, if you couldn't get a loan from the bank,
Right.
you'd go down to the line, and one of the madams would usually give you a loan.
The line.
And that's why, and I haven't mentioned this, I'll just mention it. I won't show you anything, but the woman who that Dempsey character murdered, the prostitute he murdered up in
Right.
Anchorage, then he came down and murdered the U.S. Deputy Marshal.
Right.
The prostitute, I started doing some research into her life after the book got published. So this isn't in the book, but I got her probate records. And what I found out is that she was in 1911, she was in the interior of Alaska, up in the place called Iditarod and Flat, which is a mining area. They were mining for gold up in those areas. 1911, she's there. And in her probate records, I find all of these IOU notes written to her by miners. She was giving them loans.
Yeah.
When her estate is finally settled, it's worth about $12,500.
A lot back then.
I mean, I don't know how much. I'd have to check it, how much that was worth back in
Big dollars.
1919. Big dollars, right? That's
Yeah.
a lot of money.
They did well.
So these women down the line, they had enough money to start restaurants and start businesses, and and I think a significant one of them, certainly in later years, what you begin to see, particularly after World War II, but even in the 1930s during Prohibition, organized crime started getting into the body houses
Mhm.
and taking over. The women, these old-time women, madams, had to fight gangs and organized crime to keep them. Some of them by that time just wanted to get out of that business.
Sure. There's money
They
there.
had the
So
money
here
to
comes
do
the
it.
crime. Yeah. Doug, you brought a poem today,
Oh,
and
great poem.
it's called Springtime in Alaska. We got time.
Yeah. I'll read it.
It's raining, snowing, sleeting outside. Of
This-
course, we just had some summery sun. It's not summer in Alaska. It is spring in Alaska. People still got wood stove heat for their homes. It's a nice, special time of year here. Doug's got a poem.
Okay, I've written many poems and published poems.
Yeah.
This isn't typical of my style, but I love it.
That's what we like.
This has been published many times.
Okay.
It's called Springtime in Alaska, and boy, today it's snowing out right now as I write.
A little bit of flurry. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
a little
late,
bit. Those are heavy.
late April,
Okay.
damp,
Here we
good
go.
stuff.
It's springtime in Alaska, getting lighter every day as the tour boats and the charters motor out into the bay. But white stuff still surrounds us, and we're all just sick to death. We've been shoveling since December with little time to take a breath. It's piled up to our fences, sometimes drifted 6 feet high, and the April flakes keep falling. Kind of makes you want to cry. Still, it's springtime in Alaska with an awful lot to see, but the most inspiring vision is the visqueen flying free. It's caught up in the spruce tops, it's tangled in the brush, it's scattered in the stream beds where the breakup waters rush. It's wrapped about the telewires and stuck on street lamp posts. I'm sure some's even wandered to the Kenai's outer coast. It blows along like tumbleweed and gathers in your yard. Just when you think you've cleaned it up, it catches you off guard. There's a piece upon your doorstep, another on your fence. There are fragments stuck in places that don't make a lot of sense. I step on it when walking and it wraps around my feet. I'd shake it off, but it's so cold it helps keep in the heat. Occasionally I'll spot a gem, a real Alaskan find, a symbol of the last frontier, a real one of a kind. A piece of visqueen wrapped in duct tape makes my heart go thump. My tears flow freely. Then they freeze. My throat conceals a lump. But after daylight savings and several days of rain, it's noticeably warmer and life seems less a pain. The snow starts melting quickly, leaving last year's junk behind, and backyard searching parties are amazed at what they find. The jays scream bloody murder at the magpies and the crows, while the ravens guard the dumpsters lining up in single rows. The eagles start their mating falls. Moose wander around the town. Humpbacks are spotted in the bay, and mountain goats abound. The smell of dog poop lingers on your shoes and in the air, mixed in with processed herring. It's a scent to part your hair. But it's springtime in Alaska, so no one dares complain, and those who say the sun's too bright are quickly judged insane. As spring turns into summer and summer into fall, The cottonwood snow showers make you wonder at it all. Perhaps those fluffy floating seeds are not quite what they seem. I'd like to think they're visqueen spores, if only in my dreams. They'll settle on a fertile spot, a branch, a fence, a deck, then mate up with a duct tape plant until, oh, what the heck, you get the point. It's springtime, and that affects the brain. In fact, I'll tell you, writing this has been a mental strain. But it's springtime in Alaska, when anything can go. And right about the present time, we wish it were the snow.
Nice.
Yeah.
I like
Boy,
that a
if
lot.
that isn't a day to read this poem. It's snowing out. Look at
Yeah,
that. It's heavy
perfect.
snow.
Yeah. That's good stuff. I like that. Yeah, and I've heard some of your other poems. I like that too. But that, playful, and you got a little rhyme scheme going. I think you picked an awesome symbol there with the visqueen and duct tape and the spruce top,
Yeah.
like the birds in there. That's a good one to go on here on Seward Sound Words. Doug Capra, thank you so much
Yeah.
for being on the show, for bringing all these artifacts from your collection, sharing them.
One point, if any of you in Seward want a little, if your organization, interpreters and tour guides want a little presentation on some Seward history, let me know.
Yeah, this is the guy for it. Yep, done a lot of it, collected a lot. Thanks so much for being on the show, Doug. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
Really.
Now I got to get all this stuff together.
Yeah, we did a pretty good job. We'll take care of that.
And put it back. It's going, it's going to go back in the wrong place, and I'll never be able to find
Well, it's nice to unearth it and kind of keep it fresh. I'm sure you'll kind of get into some of this a little bit more, maybe pop a new idea for something
Sure.
from an old project. But yeah, really appreciate you coming on. I had a lot of fun, always do, here in the booth. And thank you to our listeners and viewers. Really appreciate you powering the show and being behind us and supporting. So we'll see you here soon on Seward Sound Words.
Yeah.
Nice job. That was great.